My mother's text arrived at 8 Jessica is pregnant. They're moving into the farmhouse tomorrow. Babies need nature. I didn't argue. I just drove. When I pulled up, a U-Haul was parked on my lawn. Jessica was posing for photos, while my 7-year-old niece sat shivering on the stone steps, clutching a backpack. I stepped out of my car, holding a thick blue folder. The sheriff is 5 minutes away with my irrevocable trust documents, I announced, completely calm. You have exactly 10 minutes to reload that truck. They stopped moving. Sandra didn't flinch. She actually laughed. It was that same dismissive, airy chuckle she had perfected over 3 decades, the one designed to make me feel small and hysterical. Oh, Maddie, stop being so dramatic, Sandra said, waving a hand in my direction as if swatting away a minor annoyance. It is a family property. Jessica needs a calm environment for the baby. You are a single woman living in a huge house. It is simply selfish. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. Arguing implied a negotiation, and there was nothing left to negotiate. My gaze drifted past Sandra to the open doors of the U-Haul. 2 hired movers were already carrying out my antique console table, the one I had spent 6 weekends restoring. A little further away, near my greenhouse, Jessica was standing in a flowing white maternity dress. She was directing a young man with a professional camera, completely ignoring the tension in the driveway. She rested one hand on her slightly rounded stomach, offering a serene, manufactured smile to the lens. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. But my focus shifted immediately to the small figure huddled on the cold stone steps. Mia, my 7-year-old niece, looked incredibly small, drowning in a thin denim jacket. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, her eyes wide and anxious as she watched the adults tear apart the only peaceful place she knew. While Sandra kept talking, lecturing me about family duty and obligations, I walked right past her. I didn't even make eye contact. I approached the steps and knelt down until I was eye level with Mia. The crisp autumn wind was biting, and her little hands were red. I took off my heavy wool coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. "Are you okay, sweetie?" I asked softly. Mia nodded slowly, her fingers gripping the strap of her backpack until her knuckles turned white. She looked terrified, caught in a storm she didn't understand. I gave her a reassuring smile, the kind you give to someone when you have everything under absolute control. "Don't worry," I whispered. "Nobody is staying here today. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it? Let me know in the comments if you have ever had a family member demand what is rightfully yours, simply because they felt entitled to it." The movers were pausing, looking uncertainly between Sandra and me. Sandra's face flushed with anger at being ignored. "Madeline, do not walk away when I am speaking to you," she snapped, her heels clicking sharply against the gravel. "We are unloading these boxes, and you are going to help your sister set up the nursery. This is happening." I stood up slowly, turning to face the woman who had always viewed me as a resource rather than a daughter. The cold air rushed around us. I felt no panic. I felt no rage. I only felt the cold, hard certainty of the boundaries I had built. I checked my watch, tapping the glass face once. The ticking of the second hand felt loud in the sudden silence of the driveway. I watched Sandra's expression shift from supreme confidence to a flicker of genuine irritation. She was used to my compliance, not my indifference. "You have 8 minutes left." As I watched the movers hesitate, my eyes fell on the wooden console table they were holding. Seeing it suspended in the air, about to be loaded onto a truck I didn't hire, sent a vivid rush of memories through my mind. 8 years ago, this entire property was nothing but a rotting shell. I bought the farmhouse in the Hudson Valley for $210,000. It was a foreclosure, neglected and sinking into the earth. The roof was caving in, the floorboards were warped, and the greenhouse was a graveyard of shattered glass. When I signed the papers, Sandra had called it a foolish waste of money. Jessica had mocked it on her social media, joking about her sister's new life in a haunted shack. They never offered to help. They never came to visit when the heat was out, or when I was scraping layers of lead paint off the walls until my fingers bled. I spent my 20s in a cloud of sawdust and plaster. I worked full-time managing wealth for high-net-worth clients during the day, and at night, I built my own sanctuary. I learned plumbing, I learned basic electrical work, I tiled the bathrooms and restored every original pane of glass in the greenhouse. The blisters on my hands turned into calluses, and those calluses built a home. Today, the estate was appraised at $1,400,000. It was a sprawling, pristine piece of real estate with a thriving garden and a restored historic charm. And suddenly, now that the dust had settled and the property was ready for a magazine cover, it was magically transformed into a family home in their eyes. The sheer entitlement hung in the air like a foul odour. I looked at Jessica, still posing near the greenhouse. Her immaculate manicure, her flawless hair, her pristine white dress, everything about her represented the easy path. She had always navigated life on a red carpet rolled out by my parents, while I was expected to pave my own dirt road. Seeing my hand-painted sign tossed carelessly aside wasn't just a sign of disrespect. It was an attempt to erase me from my own life's work. They wanted to strip away my ownership, my history, and my identity, replacing it with their fabricated narrative. They honestly believed that because we shared the same blood, my achievements were automatically their assets. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. The scent of pine and damp earth grounded me. This was my soil, every inch of it. I had paid for it with money, time, and absolute isolation. I had structured my life to be completely independent of their demands. The console table was gently lowered back onto the driveway by the movers, who clearly wanted no part in a legal dispute. I kept my posture relaxed, my voice a steady, low hum that carried over the rustling leaves. I knew exactly what I held in my hand. I knew exactly what was about to happen. I had earned this ground. They were standing on the wrong battlefield. The movers stepped back. Sandra crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk returning to her face as if she had just remembered a winning card. "The sheriff is not going to do anything. Maddie, we are your family. Jessica is pregnant. No court is going to throw a pregnant woman out of a house when the owner is her own flesh and blood. You are bluffing." I wasn't bluffing, and I wasn't surprised. I knew they were coming. The twist wasn't their arrival. The twist was how I had found out, less than 24 hours earlier. I had been sitting in my living room, reviewing quarterly tax strategies for a client. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was an audio message from a blocked, anonymous email address. But the moment I pressed play, the tiny, trembling voice was unmistakable. It was Mia. She must have taken an old tablet from the house. "Aunt Maddie," her voice whispered, barely audible over a rustling sound. "Grandma says tomorrow your house is going to be Mom's house. She told me not to tell you." Then, the audio captured the background noise. It was Sandra, her voice carrying clearly from another room. "Just get the boxes inside and stay the night," my mother had instructed Jessica. "Once we establish residency, and there is a child in the house, the police will call it a civil matter. She won't dare drag us out in front of the neighbours." The recording clicked off, sitting in my quiet farmhouse. I hadn't felt panic. I had felt a profound, chilling clarity. They were consciously planning a hostile takeover of my property, using a 7-year-old and an unborn child as human shields to exploit tenant laws. It was calculated, predatory, and entirely in character. I didn't call Sandra to scream. I didn't text Jessica to beg them to stop. Emotional reactions were exactly what they wanted. It would give them a chance to play the victims. Instead, I opened my laptop and called Walter, my senior managing partner and co-trustee. Walter had listened to the recording in silence. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He simply said, "Gather the trust documents. Madeline, I will forward the verified copies to the local precinct tonight. Let them try." That was the difference between a victim and a strategist. A victim reacts to the blow. A strategist anticipates the strike and reinforces the wall. I had spent my entire adult life building impenetrable financial structures for other people. Did Sandra really think I would leave my own front door unlocked? I looked at my mother now, watching her false confidence radiating in the morning sun. She thought she was playing a game of emotional blackmail. She didn't realise she had stepped into a legal fortress. I tapped my blue folder gently against my leg. The irony was almost poetic. They had spent weeks plotting to sneak in and claim squatters' rights, relying on my supposed weakness. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of community judgment or familial guilt. But I had spent years analysing risk, closing loopholes, and protecting assets from people exactly like them. Sandra was about to learn a very expensive lesson in property law. The siren echoed far away. To understand why Sandra believed I would simply hand over a $1,400,000 estate, you have to understand the invisible chains of a glass child. In our family dynamic, Jessica was the sun, and everyone else existed purely to orbit her. From the time we were little, Jessica was the beautiful, fragile star destined for greatness, while I was the sturdy, unproblematic background character. When I was 15, my parents secretly mortgaged the college fund my grandparents had left me. They used the money to pay for Jessica's elite modelling camps and styling portfolios. When I confronted them, Sandra had looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Jessica needs this investment to launch her career. Madeline, you are smart, you can get a scholarship, you do not need our help." It was the ultimate normalisation of betrayal. Over the years, I learned that my achievements were invisible unless they could be harvested. When I graduated at the top of my class, they skipped the ceremony because Jessica had a minor breakdown over a breakup. When I secured my first job at a prestigious wealth management firm, my father's only response was to ask if I could co-sign a car loan for Jessica. I became the designated survivor. I learned to navigate the world silently, building my own security because I knew the safety net of family did not exist for me. It is a psychological trap that many people fall into the belief that if you just sacrifice enough, if you just stay quiet and helpful, eventually you will earn their respect. But toxic families do not respect sacrifice. They only consume it. They view your independence not as a boundary, but as an endless resource they can tap into whenever their preferred child fails. That was why Sandra felt no guilt bringing a U-Haul to my driveway. In her mind, I didn't own a home. I was simply holding onto an asset until Jessica needed it. She believed my lifetime of quiet compliance meant I would surrender out of habit. But she had fundamentally misunderstood what my silence meant. My silence hadn't been submission. It had been preparation. I chose to specialise in estate management specifically to understand the mechanisms of control. I learned how to build legal structures that could withstand any emotional manipulation, any greedy relative, and any unforeseen disaster. I didn't just build a farmhouse. I built a vault. And as I looked at Sandra's self-satisfied face, waiting for me to crack, I realised that the frightened 15-year-old girl whose college fund was stolen was gone forever. The woman standing in the driveway was a seasoned trustee. I checked my watch again. The air was perfectly still, holding its breath before the storm. I glanced at Mia, who was still clutching my coat around her shoulders. She was the only innocent soul in this entire charade, I would protect her, but I would absolutely not protect the adults who had dragged her into this mess. The sound of tyres crunching on the gravel road at the end of the property broke the silence. A white patrol vehicle with flashing blue lights was slowly making its way up the long, tree-lined driveway. Time was finally up. When you grow up in a house where your worth is measured by how much you can surrender, you eventually have to find your own guides in the world. For me, that guide was Walter. Walter was 65 years old, a senior managing partner at my firm, and a man who spoke entirely in clauses, contingencies, and calculated risks. He had hired me when I was fresh out of college, seeing past my quiet demeanour to the relentless work ethic underneath. He was the one who taught me that a contract was infinitely more reliable than a bloodline. 3 years ago, when the farmhouse renovations were finally nearing completion, the local property values in the Hudson Valley began to skyrocket. My modest $210,000 investment was suddenly drawing attention from high-end real estate developers. I remember sitting in Walter's corner office, looking at the appraisal report. I felt a rare moment of pride. But Walter looked at me with genuine concern. He placed his tortoiseshell glasses on the mahogany desk and folded his hands. "Madeline," he had said, his voice carrying the gravity of decades in estate law, "you have built a remarkable asset, but you have a family that views your successes as their emergency fund. The moment they realise what this property is worth, they will find a reason to need it. You must protect it before they ask." I had hesitated. Even after years of being sidelined by Sandra, the lingering guilt of the invisible child still whispered in my ear. Was it paranoid to legally shield my home from my own mother and sister? Walter saw my hesitation. He didn't offer emotional comfort, he offered a process. "Do not wait for a crisis to build a wall," he advised gently. "Build the fortress while it is quiet. That way, when the siege comes, you do not have to fight. You just let the walls do their job." That afternoon, Walter and I drafted the paperwork for the Hudson Valley Heritage Irrevocable Trust. We didn't just transfer the deed, we layered it with protective clauses, strict operational guidelines, and designated Walter as my co-trustee. Any alteration, any lease, any transfer of occupancy required both of our signatures. It was an ironclad structure, completely immune to emotional manipulation or sudden familial demands. Sandra thought she was dealing with a compliant, soft-spoken daughter who would eventually bow to maternal pressure. She had no idea she was actually trying to break into a heavily fortified corporate entity. Walter had given me the tools to separate my emotions from my assets. He didn't just teach me how to manage wealth for billionaires. He showed me how to secure my own peace of mind in a world that constantly demanded my sacrifice. He taught me how, despite my strict financial boundaries, I was not completely devoid of weakness. If you look closely enough at my meticulously managed life, there was exactly one crack in the armour. Her name was Mia, looking at my 7-year-old niece shivering on the stone steps. I felt the familiar ache of responsibility. I knew exactly what it felt like to be a prop in Jessica's flawless, curated universe. I refused to let Mia suffer the same fate. 3 years ago, Jessica had enrolled Mia in a prestigious private academy. It was a school chosen entirely for its aesthetic uniforms and the networking opportunities it provided for influencer parents. Within 6 months, Jessica had defaulted on the tuition. The school administration had sent a final notice of expulsion, which Jessica had casually ignored because she was busy financing a luxury trip to Tulum. I couldn't bear the thought of Mia being publicly pulled from her classroom. I intervened, but I did it quietly. I agreed to cover the tuition, setting up a direct monthly transfer. However, Jessica, always desperate to maintain the illusion of absolute control and wealth, threw a massive tantrum. She insisted that the money be routed through a learning account under her name, claiming the school required payments directly from the custodial parent. It was a lie, but it was the only compromise that kept Mia in her classes. To satisfy the Academy's stringent financial requirements, I had to sign a series of physical guarantor forms. They needed my legal signature on file to prove the funds were secured by a verified source. I remember sitting in the school's administrative office, signing those thick, watermark pages with a blue fountain pen. It was a standard procedure for a private institution. I didn't think twice about it at the time. I was just trying to buy a little girl some stability. I never imagined that those signatures would be weaponized against me. I never considered that Sandra, with her complete disregard for ethical boundaries, would eventually dig through Jessica's files, locate those specific financial guarantor documents, and scan them. I didn't know they would cleanly crop my signature from a document meant to protect a child's education, only to paste it onto a fraudulent lease agreement. They thought they were incredibly clever. They believed they had found the perfect loophole, using my own documented generosity to forge a key to my farmhouse. But in their rush to manufacture a legal claim, they failed to consider the fundamental mechanics of my profession. They thought a simple signature on a piece of paper would be enough to paralyze local law enforcement. They forgot what I do. The flashing blue lights of Sheriff Miller's cruiser began to sweep across the driveway. But my attention was temporarily caught by something else. Through the large original pane windows of my front porch, I could see straight into my home office. It was the room where I handled multi-million-dollar portfolios, a space defined by order, confidentiality, and quiet focus. Now, it was a disaster zone. Jessica had evidently instructed the movers to clear it out first. The heavy mahogany desk I had meticulously polished was shoved into a corner, bearing a bright neon sticker that read, "Sell." My ergonomic chair was tossed out onto the grass. But what made my blood run instantly cold was the plastic storage bin left carelessly near the edge of the lawn, right next to a damp garden hose. Inside that bin were my client files. Thick, confidential dossiers containing estate plans, trust configurations, and sensitive financial data for high net worth families. They were supposed to be locked in a secure filing cabinet. Instead, they were treated like worthless trash, exposed to the elements. Through the window, I watched one of the movers unrolling a massive ring light and setting it up where my desk used to be. Jessica was walking around the room, gesturing expansively. She was already planning her nursery reveal angles. She intended to turn the nerve centre of my professional life into a bright, vacant set for her lifestyle content. The sheer, breathtaking disrespect of it settled heavily in my chest. If there had been even a microscopic fraction of guilt left in me about turning them away, the sight of those client files in the dirt completely eradicated it. This wasn't a desperate family seeking temporary shelter. This was an invasion. They had no intention of respecting my space or my livelihood. They had walked into my sanctuary and immediately begun erasing me. To them, my career was just a cute hobby, easily discarded to make room for Jessica's social media aesthetic. I took a slow step toward the plastic bin on the grass. I carefully lifted the lid, verifying that the files were still dry and intact. I locked the bin and pulled it close to my side. I didn't yell at the movers. They were just men doing a job they were paid for. I didn't scream at Jessica through the window. The rage I felt was entirely silent, compressing itself into a sharp, focused point. Sandra had always demanded that I sacrifice my comfort for family unity, but compromising my professional integrity and my client's security was a line I would never cross. By throwing those files onto the lawn, they hadn't just insulted me. They had provided the absolute moral clarity I needed to execute what was coming next. I smoothed the lapel of my blouse, feeling entirely calm. The bridge was finally burned. As I stood guarding my client files, a sudden gust of autumn wind swept across the lawn, lifting a stray piece of paper from a decorative clipboard resting on a folding chair. The clipboard had clearly been set up by Jessica as her command centre for the move. I reached out and caught the paper before it could flutter into the flower beds. It was a printed email thread, and the logo at the top belonged to a premium, organic maternity brand. I let my eyes scan the text. It wasn't a simple sponsorship inquiry. It was a finalised, legally binding contract for the Rustic Roots Lifestyle campaign. The terms were explicitly spelled out. Jessica was to deliver 12 high-production videos and a professional photoshoot series documenting her slow, grounded family life in her newly acquired historic farmhouse. The brand had already wired an $85,000 advance. The realisation clicked into place with mathematical precision. Jessica didn't want to live here because she needed fresh air or a safe environment for her baby. She was here because she had already sold the aesthetic of my home to a corporate sponsor. She had monetised my 8 years of gruelling labour. If she didn't deliver the farmhouse content by the end of the month, she would be in breach of contract. She would have to return the $85,000 money I was absolutely certain she had already spent. I looked over at her, still adjusting her flowing white dress for the camera. Her entire life was a carefully constructed illusion, built on a foundation of unpaid debts and borrowed scenery. She was terrified. The desperation hiding behind her serene, curated smile must have been suffocating. She wasn't an entitled princess merely demanding a favour. She was a failing businesswoman facing a massive financial penalty, trying to use my property to bail herself out of a fraudulent contract. Sandra walked up behind me, noticing the paper in my hand. "It is a wonderful opportunity for your sister," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "She is building a brand, Madeline. This house is perfect for her demographic. You should be proud to help her succeed. It is what families do." I folded the contract neatly and placed it in my pocket. I didn't bother explaining that fraud was not a family value. I didn't mention that claiming ownership of a property you didn't buy to secure a corporate sponsorship was perilously close to a felony. I just let Sandra talk, listening to her weave a narrative of sisterly support that completely ignored reality. They had gambled their financial survival on the assumption that I would simply surrender. It was just a set. While Jessica's motive was driven by a fraudulent brand deal, Sandra's desperation ran much deeper. As the sheriff's vehicle finally rolled to a complete stop at the edge of the driveway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a voicemail notification from my father, left almost an hour ago while I had been driving. I pressed the phone to my ear, keeping my eyes fixed on the flashing lights of the police cruiser. My father's voice was shaking. He sounded small, frail, and utterly panicked. "Maddie, please, please just let them in. You have to let them stay." He paused, his breath rattling against the microphone. "The bank sent the final notice yesterday. We have 14 days before the foreclosure auction. Sandra told the loan officer we were establishing residency at a secondary family property you owned. She used your address to file a delay." The message ended. I lowered the phone. Suddenly, the entire picture was complete. The chaotic, aggressive move, the sudden, unannounced arrival, the attempt to forge a legal foothold. It wasn't just about Jessica's social media contract. It was about sheer survival. For years. Sandra had been secretly remortgaging their suburban home to cover Jessica's endless credit card debts and lifestyle expenses. They had bled their own equity dry to keep Jessica's illusion alive. Now, the bill had finally come due. They were losing their home in 2 weeks. My meticulously restored $1.4 million farmhouse wasn't just a convenient backdrop. It was their only remaining life raft. Sandra truly believed that if she could just physically wedge her family inside my walls, She could manipulate me into assuming their massive financial liabilities. She intended to make me their permanent landlord, their saviour, and ultimately, their casualty. My father's voicemail wasn't a warning, it was a plea for complicity. He knew Sandra's plan was deeply wrong, but he was too weak to stop it. He wanted me to quietly absorb the impact of their disastrous financial choices so he wouldn't have to face the humiliation of homelessness. He wanted me to set myself on fire to keep them warm. I looked at Sandra, who was already marching toward Sheriff Miller with a practiced, welcoming smile, completely unaware that I had just listened to the truth. She thought she was playing a masterful game of chess, using a pregnant daughter and a forged document to secure her retirement. She didn't realise she was stepping onto a board where every piece was already bolted down. The sheer weight of their collective entitlement was staggering, but it didn't touch me. I felt only the cold, unyielding structure of the trust I had built. They were already drowning. Sheriff Miller's patrol vehicle came to a slow, crunching halt on the gravel of my driveway. He was a veteran officer, a man who had seen every possible variation of domestic disputes and property conflicts in the county. Before he even had a chance to put the cruiser in park and unbuckle his seatbelt, Sandra was already making her approach. I watched my mother smooth down her cashmere cardigan, pasting on a radiant, artificially warm smile that she reserved specifically for authority figures. From where I stood near the porch, I didn't rush forward to intercept them. I didn't feel the sudden, desperate urge to shout my side of the story or plead for the officer's understanding. That was the behaviour of a victim, and I had abandoned that role years ago. Instead, I observed the scene with the exact same clinical detachment I used when auditing a failing corporate portfolio. In my line of work as a wealth manager and trustee, you learn to identify toxic assets quickly. You learn that emotional attachment to a bad investment will only accelerate your bankruptcy. For 32 years, my family had been a bad investment. The more I gave, the more they extracted. Society conditions us to believe that blood ties require infinite patience and unconditional forgiveness. We are taught to normalise the exploitation of the responsible child to subsidise the reckless one. But looking at Sandra now, frantically waving her hands as she tried to spin a narrative of a simple familial misunderstanding to the sheriff, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the quiet, calculating hum of a trustee preparing to liquidate a liability. In the world of finance, there is a concept known as the sunk cost fallacy. It is the phenomenon where a person continues to pour resources into a failing endeavour, simply because they have already invested so much time or money into it. Sandra believed I was trapped in that fallacy. She assumed that because I had spent a lifetime seeking her approval, I would eventually cave to her demands just to keep the peace. She thought the weight of our shared history would crush my resolve. But she didn't realise that my mindset had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the daughter hoping to be seen. I was the legal custodian of my own life. I had spent 8 years pouring my blood, sweat, and income into the soil of this Hudson Valley farmhouse. I had secured it behind layers of ironclad legal documentation. I watched Sheriff Miller step out of his vehicle, his hand resting casually on his utility belt, his expression sceptical as Sandra continued her frantic, hushed monologue. He nodded politely but kept his distance. I took a slow breath of the crisp autumn air. I didn't need to argue. The paperwork resting in my blue folder spoke louder than any emotional outburst ever could. I was completely ready. While Sandra was busy attempting to charm Sheriff Miller, I turned my attention away from the legal theatre and walked over to the stone steps where Mia was still sitting. The wind had picked up, sending a flurry of golden leaves dancing across the driveway. I pulled my wool coat a little tighter around her small shoulders. She looked up at me, her large brown eyes reflecting a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. "Are you hungry, sweetie?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and steady. I have some granola bars in the car. Mia shook her head slightly. She hugged her worn-out canvas backpack tighter against her chest. I noticed a small stain on the knee of her jeans and the scuffed toes of her sneakers. It was a stark, jarring contrast to her mother, just 30 feet away. Jessica was wearing a pristine, custom-fitted maternity gown and $300 suede boots, practically glowing under the artificial light she had instructed the movers to set up. "What do you have in your bag?" I asked, trying to distract her from the chaotic scene unfolding on the lawn. "Just my colouring books," Mia mumbled, tracing a finger over the zipper. "That's great," I smiled warmly. "Are you still painting those beautiful watercolour landscapes? Have you showed Mrs. Gable the new techniques we practiced last month?" Mrs. Gable was the lead art instructor at the expensive private academy. Mia attended the academy I had been quietly funding for the past 3 years. Mia looked down at her shoes, suddenly hesitant. "I don't see Mrs. Gable anymore. Aunt Maddie?" I frowned, a slight prickle of confusion breaking through my calm exterior. "Did she retire, or did you switch to a different art class?" "No," Mia replied innocently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mummy said the art classes were too far to drive to. I haven't been to that school since the spring. Mummy says I'm going to be homeschooled now." The autumn wind suddenly felt like ice. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. My mind, trained to process numbers and detect discrepancies, instantly ran the math. $1,200 a month. That was the exact amount I had been automatically transferring into Jessica's designated learning account for the past 6 months. $7,200. If Mia hadn't been enrolled in the academy since the spring, where had that money gone? I looked up from Mia's scuffed sneakers and stared directly at Jessica. She was adjusting her hair, completely oblivious to the devastating truth her daughter had just innocently revealed. The money meant to secure a 7-year-old's education. The funds I had sacrificed my own savings to provide had been diverted. It had been funneled into designer maternity dresses, high-end camera equipment, and the maintenance of an elaborate social media lie. Jessica hadn't just stolen from me, she had robbed her own child. The math was brutal. The revelation of the stolen tuition money didn't trigger a massive explosion of rage. It didn't make me want to march across the lawn and scream at Jessica until my throat bled. Instead, it did something far more permanent. It dropped the temperature of my empathy to absolute 0. Any lingering, microscopic shred of familial guilt I might have harboured about turning them away evaporated into the cold autumn air. There is a profound difference between a desperate family making poor choices and a predatory family actively exploiting a child's future for vanity. When my father left that panicked voicemail about the bank foreclosing on their house, a tiny part of me had pitied him. I had understood that their backs were against the wall. But this systematic theft of Mia's educational funds proved that their crisis was entirely self-inflicted and completely devoid of morality. Sandra had to have known. She lived in the same house as Jessica and Mia. She would have noticed that her granddaughter was no longer putting on a uniform or attending private art classes. But Sandra chose to remain silent. She chose to protect Jessica's lavish lifestyle over Mia's fundamental needs. They had all tacitly agreed to use my financial support not as a safety net, but as a slush fund to finance an illusion. I stood up slowly, looking down at Mia. She had no idea she had just handed me the final, necessary piece of the puzzle. I gave her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. "Keep drawing, Mia. You're going to have a beautiful place to paint very soon, I promise." I turned my back on the steps and faced the driveway. The concept of family loyalty is a powerful biological and social imperative. We are conditioned to protect our tribe at all costs. But what do you do when your tribe is the very thing trying to consume you? You build a boundary so thick and so high that they break their own teeth trying to bite through it. I was no longer just protecting a piece of real estate in the Hudson Valley. I was defending the principle of basic human decency. They thought they could waltz onto my property, claim my accomplishments, and discard my belongings because we shared the same last name. They believed their manufactured emergency gave them the right to suspend all rules of ownership and respect. They were about to discover that my boundaries were not suggestions. They were fortified, legally binding walls. I smoothed the cover of the blue folder in my hands, feeling the textured paper beneath my fingertips. Empathy was officially dead. Sheriff Miller had finally managed to politely interrupt Sandra's endless stream of excuses. He asked her to step back while he retrieved his notepad and radioed dispatch to log the incident. Seeing that her initial charm offensive hadn't immediately resulted in the sheriff handing over the keys to my house, Sandra pivoted. She abandoned the officer and marched directly across the lawn toward me. Her face was tight, her jaw locked in a familiar expression of maternal disappointment. "Madeline, what on earth are you doing?" she hissed, keeping her voice low enough so the sheriff wouldn't hear the venom. "Calling the police on your own mother. Have you lost your mind?" "I called the police on unauthorized trespassers attempting to occupy my property," I replied evenly, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. Sandra let out a sharp, incredulous scoff. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me. "This is a family estate. You are a single woman, Maddie. You have $1,400,000 in equity sitting here. You have 4 empty bedrooms. Your sister is carrying a child. She needs peace, and she needs space. You cannot possibly be so selfish as to hoard this entire place for yourself." It was a masterful display of gaslighting. In Sandra's reality, my years of backbreaking labour, my financial discipline, and my strict saving habits were completely irrelevant. My success was simply an unfair distribution of resources that needed to be forcibly redistributed to Jessica. "It is not a family estate." "Sandra," I said, using her first name. I saw her eyes widen slightly at the deliberate disrespect. "It is my house. I bought it. I rebuilt it. You called it a rotting shack 8 years ago. You don't get to claim it now just because it looks good on camera." "We are about to lose our home," Sandra finally snapped, her voice cracking with genuine panic. The polished facade slipped for just a second. "The bank is taking the house in 2 weeks. If Jessica doesn't shoot her campaign here, she loses her brand deal. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. You are going to put your pregnant sister on the street over a piece of paper." She stared at me, waiting for the guilt to set in. She was waiting for the obedient, invisible child to finally apologise and open the front door. She expected my walls to crumble under the weight of her manufactured tragedy. I looked at her, noting the expensive highlights in her hair and the designer bag slung over her shoulder. They were going bankrupt, yet they still refused to put down the props. "Yes," I answered simply. She stared in absolute shock. Sandra's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled out of water. She had never heard me speak with such absolute, unwavering coldness. Before she could recover and launch into another tirade about family loyalty, the crunching of heavy boots on the gravel announced the arrival of Sheriff Miller. He walked with the slow, measured pace of a man who dealt with property disputes entirely by the book. At the exact same moment, Jessica realised that the situation was escalating away from their control. Her brand deal, her carefully curated image, and her financial bailout were all slipping through her fingers. She abandoned her elegant poses by the greenhouse. She pulled out her smartphone, tapped the screen, and the bright, glaring ring light she had set up on the lawn illuminated her face. She was live streaming. "Hey guys," Jessica said, her voice instantly dropping into a trembling, fragile register. Tears sprang to her eyes with terrifying speed. I am so sorry to go live like this, but I am terrified. My sister just called the police on me. I am pregnant, and she's trying to force me and my little girl out onto the street. Please, I just need support right now. She turned the camera, making sure to capture the flashing lights of the police cruiser, the moving boxes, and then, finally, panning directly to me. She was actively building a digital mob, hoping the pressure of 1,000 angry internet strangers would force me to surrender. Before we go any further, I have to ask, if you have ever watched a toxic person flawlessly play the victim immediately after trying to destroy you, drop A in the comments. It is a universal experience, and it is infuriating. I didn't hide from the camera. I didn't hold my hands up to block the lens. I simply stood there, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of calm. Let her record. Let her document every single second of what was about to happen. Sheriff Miller stepped between Sandra and me, his notepad open. He looked directly at me, acknowledging my stance. "Ma'am, I am Sheriff Miller. We received a call regarding an unauthorised entry and an attempted illegal eviction," he said, his voice carrying an authoritative baritone. He turned his gaze to Sandra and Jessica, who was still weeping perfectly for her audience. "Do either of you have proof of ownership, a signed lease, or any legal documentation establishing your right to occupy this property today?" Jessica sobbed louder for the camera. Sandra puffed up her chest, ready to argue the moral technicalities of motherhood. I didn't let them speak. I unclasped the elastic band on my thick blue folder. The crisp sound of the heavy paper shifting caught the sheriff's attention. I pulled out the verified, notarized stack of documents that Walter had prepared. I handed the first page to the officer. The game was over. Sheriff Miller adjusted his utility belt, taking the heavy blue folder from my hands. He flipped it open, pulling a pen from his breast pocket to trace the lines of text. The morning sun glared off the pristine, watermarked paper. Sandra took a confident step forward, craning her neck to look over the officer's arm. She still carried that smug, unbothered expression, utterly convinced that whatever I had handed him was just a meaningless printout, perhaps a utility bill or a property tax receipt. She honestly believed that blood relations superseded local ordinances. "Officer, this is ridiculous," Sandra sighed, waving her hand dismissively toward me. "My daughter bought this house years ago. Her name is on the deed. I am her mother. She invited us to stay because her sister is expecting a child. It is a simple family arrangement that she is suddenly trying to back out of because of a petty sibling rivalry." Sheriff Miller did not look up from the document. He turned to the second page, his eyes scanning the dense, meticulously drafted legal clauses. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my slacks. I didn't interrupt Sandra's fabricated narrative. I simply let her lie to a sworn law enforcement officer on the record. In my profession, you learn that the quickest way to dismantle a fraud is to let them talk until they contradict the paperwork. Finally. The sheriff lowered the folder. He looked at Sandra, his expression shifting from neutral observation to strict, professional authority. "Ma'am, according to this verified documentation, Madeline is not the legal owner of this property," he stated clearly, his baritone voice echoing off the side of the U-Haul truck. Sandra blinked, her confident smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She turned her head, glaring at me. "What is he talking about?" "Maddie, you bought this place in 2018. I saw the closing papers." I met her gaze with absolute unblinking calm. "I did buy it in 2018, Sandra," I replied evenly. "And in 2023, I transferred the entire estate, including the land, the greenhouse, and the primary residence, into an entity. This property is exclusively owned by the Hudson Valley Heritage Irrevocable Trust. I am a designated beneficiary and a managing trustee, but I do not hold the title as an individual." So, Jessica lowered her phone slightly, the live stream forgotten for a moment as confusion washed over her perfectly contoured face. They didn't understand what those words meant, but they could hear the heavy, immovable finality in my tone. They had come prepared to bully a daughter. They hadn't prepared to fight a corporate structure. Sandra's eyes darted back to the sheriff, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. She was trying to comprehend a language she had never bothered to learn. The fortress was officially locked. To the average person, an irrevocable trust sounds like a complicated piece of financial jargon reserved for billionaires and tax evasion. But in reality, it is the ultimate architectural blueprint for personal boundaries. When I set up the trust with Walter 3 years ago, my goal wasn't just to protect my net worth. My goal was to create a legal mechanism that completely neutralized Sandra's specific brand of emotional manipulation. I looked at my mother and my sister, watching their minds struggle to process the concept. I decided to offer them a brief, free consultation. "Let me explain how this works. Sandra," I said, my voice as steady and precise as a metronome, because the trust is irrevocable. The assets placed inside it are permanently removed from my personal estate. I cannot unilaterally sell it. I cannot borrow against its equity to pay off someone else's credit card debt. And, most importantly for today, I do not have the legal authority to grant long-term residency to anyone without the explicit, notarized approval of my co-trustee. Sandra's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The reality of the situation was finally piercing through her delusion. She couldn't guilt-trip a piece of paper. She couldn't cry, scream, or manipulate a legal entity into feeling sorry for her. The psychological weapons she had spent 32 years sharpening against me were completely useless against a properly executed legal document. "This is insane," Sandra finally yelled, dropping the calm, maternal act entirely. "You did this just to keep your own family out. You locked up your house just to spite us. I secured an asset to protect it from unauthorized liquidation." I corrected her calmly. "You view family as a license to bypass consent. I view it as a liability that requires rigorous documentation. You cannot occupy this property because the trust does not permit it. Period. Justice, I have learned, rarely looks like a dramatic courtroom movie scene. It doesn't come with a swelling orchestral soundtrack or a tearful confession. True, lasting justice is incredibly boring. It is quiet, it is clean. It is found in the precise wording of a contract, in the undeniable stamp of a notary, and in the cold, hard boundaries of a process that cannot be bypassed by a temper tantrum. I watched the two movers slowly lower a box labelled Jessica's Nursery back onto the asphalt. They were looking at the sheriff, realising that they were currently aiding in a trespassing violation. The entire dynamic of the driveway had shifted. The chaotic energy brought by the U-Haul had crashed against a brick wall of corporate governance. Sandra had always relied on my emotions to get her way. She was completely unarmed against my apathy. I checked my watch again. Sheriff Miller reviewed the final page of the trust agreement. He was a thorough man, and I appreciated his diligence. He tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Ms. Madeline," he said, turning to me. "The documentation appears pristine. However, standard protocol for a trust dispute on site requires me to verify the status of the co-trustee. Do you have a direct line for this Walter Higgins?" "I do," I replied, pulling my phone from my pocket. "He is expecting your call." I unlocked my screen, dialed Walter's private office line, and put the phone on speaker. It rang exactly twice before his crisp, authoritative voice filled the crisp autumn air. "Walter Higgins speaking." "Mr. Higgins, this is Sheriff Miller with the County Police Department," the officer said, leaning slightly toward the phone. "I am standing here with your co-trustee at the Hudson Valley property. I need to verify that no authorization has been granted for new residents to occupy the premises." That is correct. Sheriff? Walter replied instantly, his tone carrying the weight of a senior legal partner. The trust has explicitly forbidden any transfer of occupancy. Any individuals attempting to move belongings into the estate or claiming residency are doing so illegally. We will press full criminal trespassing charges if they do not vacate immediately. Understood. Thank you for your time, Mr. Higgins, the sheriff said. I tapped the screen to end the call. The silence that followed was absolute. Before we move forward, I need to know your thoughts. If you believe that ironclad legal boundaries are the only way to handle relentlessly toxic people, leave A in the comments. Let's see how many of us have had to build walls to protect our peace. Sheriff Miller handed the blue folder back to me. He then turned his full, imposing attention to Sandra and Jessica. "Ma'am," he said, and there was no longer any trace of polite accommodation in his voice. "The legal ownership is not in dispute. You have no legal standing to be on this property. You need to instruct your hired hands to load everything they just took out back into that truck, and then you need to leave the premises." Jessica let out a loud, theatrical sob, holding her smartphone up higher to make sure her tears were captured in high definition. "This is police brutality," she cried to her live audience. "They are literally throwing a pregnant woman onto the street because of a legal loophole." I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't flinch. I just watched her perform. She was trying to generate digital outrage because she had zero legal leverage. But the movers weren't interested in being extras in her viral tragedy. The older of the two men, wearing a worn baseball cap, looked at Sandra and shook his head. "Look, lady, we ain't getting arrested for a domestic dispute. We're packing this back up." The retreat had begun. The reality of the situation crashed down on Sandra and Jessica like a physical weight. The U-Haul movers began aggressively hauling the antique console table and the boxes back up the metal ramp, their movements sharp and annoyed. They were moving twice as fast as they had when unloading. They wanted to be off my property before the sheriff decided to start writing citations. Sandra stood paralysed in the middle of the driveway. For the first time in my entire life, I saw her completely out of moves. Her face was pale, the artificial warmth entirely stripped away. She stared at the blue folder in my hands as if it were a venomous snake. She had gambled everything on my submission. And now, the house of cards was collapsing in real time. "You planned this," Sandra whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and suppressed rage. She took a step toward me, pointing an accusing finger. "You let us drive all the way out here. You let Jessica pack up her entire apartment. You knew we had nowhere else to go. And you sat there and plotted this trap just to humiliate us." I looked at her, my expression remaining completely passive. "I plan to secure my financial future. Sandra, the fact that my security feels like a trap to you simply proves that you always intended to trespass. I am your mother," she screamed, finally losing control. The sheer volume of her voice startled a flock of birds from the nearby oak trees. "You owe me, I raised you, we are family." "Family is a mutual support system," I replied, keeping my voice low and level. I refused to match her volume. "What you are describing is a parasitic relationship. You are not a mother looking for shelter. You are a debtor looking for a bailout, and the bank is closed." Jessica, seeing that the emotional manipulation was failing miserably, tried a different angle. She moved the camera away from her tear-stained face and pointed it aggressively at my client files, which were still sitting in the locked plastic bin on the grass. "Look at this," she cried to her live stream viewers. "She cares more about her stupid paperwork than her own blood. She is a heartless, corporate monster." I slowly walked over to the plastic bin. I didn't rush. I bent down, ensuring the lock was still secure, and lifted the heavy container by its side handles. I turned back to face the camera lens directly. I didn't look angry. I looked profoundly bored. Those are confidential financial records belonging to people who actually pay their bills, I said smoothly, ensuring the audio picked up every syllable. I protect my clients with the exact same ruthless efficiency that I use to protect my home. That is why they trust me. I carried the bin inside. I placed the bin of client files securely inside the hallway and walked back out onto the porch. The crisp air felt remarkably clean. The movers had finished reloading the U-Haul. The older man slammed the rolling metal door shut and secured the latch. He walked over to Sandra, pulling a clipboard from his pocket. "That's everything, ma'am," he said gruffly. "We need the remaining balance for the hourly rate, and we are out of here." Sandra's hands shook as she dug through her designer purse. Pulling out a credit card, I knew, with almost absolute certainty, that the card was dangerously close to its limit. The heavy reality of their situation was settling in. They had no new farmhouse to shoot a lucrative brand deal. They had a foreclosing suburban home, a mountain of Jessica's debt, and a U-Haul full of boxes with nowhere to go. Sheriff Miller stood by his cruiser, watching the transaction. "Once the truck is settled, I need your personal vehicles moved off the driveway. Ma'am, this is a final warning." Jessica leaned against the side of her luxury SUV. Her live stream finally ended. The adrenaline of the performance had faded, leaving behind the stark terror of a woman realizing her entire aesthetic empire was about to collapse. She looked at me, genuine fear finally replacing the entitled superiority in her eyes. "Maddie, please," she whispered, dropping the influencer persona. "I already spent the advance from the sponsor. If I don't shoot here, they will sue me. I will be ruined." I stood on the porch, looking down at the sister who had happily let my college fund be drained for her modelling camps. I looked at the woman who had stolen her own daughter's tuition money to buy designer clothes. Empathy is a finite resource, and I had exhausted my supply years ago. "You built a business on a lie, Jessica," I said quietly. "A lie requires maintenance. I am not legally or morally obligated to provide the maintenance for your fraud. You will have to call your sponsor and tell them the truth. You are destroying this family," Sandra spat, waving her receipt at me. "No," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I am just refusing to be collateral damage in your destruction. There is a very clear difference." I watched Sheriff Miller motion for them to get into their vehicles. The battle was seemingly over. The legal documentation had held the line perfectly. But as Sandra walked toward her car, she stopped. Her hand hovered over the door handle. A dark, desperate shadow crossed her face. She wasn't ready to surrender. She took a deep breath, reached into her blazer pocket, and pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled piece of white paper. She turned back to the sheriff, a chilling, triumphant smile slowly spreading across her face. She played her final card. Sandra marched back toward Sheriff Miller, her heels striking the pavement with renewed, aggressive energy. She unfolded the crumpled piece of paper with a sharp snap and thrust it toward the officer. "We are not trespassing, Sheriff," she announced, her voice ringing out with artificial triumph. "My daughter likes to play these little power games, but the law is the law. We are legally contracted tenants. This is a signed 12-month lease agreement for the farmhouse." Sheriff Miller's expression shifted. He took the paper from Sandra, his brow furrowing as he read the heading. In the eyes of local law enforcement, the word lease instantly transforms a simple trespassing call into a complicated civil nightmare. Police officers cannot unilaterally evict tenants on the spot without a court order, even if the landlord is standing right there. Sandra had clearly done just enough internet research to know exactly which legal buzzword would paralyze a patrol officer. Jessica, sensing the sudden shift in momentum, immediately brightened. The crushing fear from a few moments ago vanished, replaced by a vicious, gloating smirk. She crossed her arms over her maternity dress, looking at me as if she had just won a grand prize. She actually turned to the older mover, who was standing by the U-Haul. "You can open the truck back up," she instructed him smoothly. "We are staying. It turns out my sister forgot she rented the house to us." Sheriff Miller looked up from the paper, his jaw tight. He turned to me, holding the document out so I could see it. "Ms. Madeline," he said, his tone heavily guarded. "This document is dated 3 weeks ago. It outlines a standard residential lease for this property, and it appears to have your verified signature at the bottom. If this is a valid contract, this is a landlord-tenant dispute. I cannot legally force them to vacate without a formal eviction notice from a judge." Sandra smiled. It was the smile of a predator who believed she had just outsmarted the trap. She thought she had found the ultimate loophole. She believed that by injecting the slow, bureaucratic process of civil court into the situation, she could secure the property for months, completely derailing my life and saving her own. I didn't gasp. I didn't reach out to snatch the paper from the sheriff's hands. I didn't frantically accuse my mother of forgery in a high-pitched scream. I simply stepped closer, adjusting my glasses, and looked down at the document the officer was holding. I analysed it with the exact same clinical precision I used to review corporate tax returns. I looked at the date, I looked at the formatting, and then I looked at the signature. It was a perfectly executed, flawless replica of my handwriting, but it wasn't a fresh signature. It was a digital scan, and I knew exactly where they had stolen it from. I looked up at Sandra. She had made a fatal miscalculation. "May I look closer at that, Sheriff?" I asked quietly. Sheriff Miller handed me the document. I held it up to the morning light. "This is a fascinating piece of fiction," I said, my voice completely devoid of panic. "First, let's look at the signature. It is a digital copy. Specifically, it was cropped from a financial guarantor form for the Oak Ridge Private Academy, the school where I have been secretly funding my niece's tuition for the past 3 years. If you look closely at the tail of the M, there is a tiny ink smudge. It is identical to the smudge on the school's carbon copy records." Sandra's triumphant smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "You are being ridiculous, Maddie. You signed that lease in person. Stop lying to the police." I ignored her completely and turned back to the officer. "Second," I continued, tapping the top right corner of the page. "Let's examine the date. This document claims I signed it in person on October 14th. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, dark blue booklet. I opened my passport and handed it to Sheriff Miller. On October 14th, I was attending an international estate planning conference in London. As you can see from the customs stamp, I did not re-enter the United States until October 18th. It is physically impossible for me to have executed this document." Jessica's face went entirely pale. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization that they had just handed a forged legal document to a sworn officer of the law. "But third, and most importantly," I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that commanded absolute silence in the driveway. "Even if I had been here, and even if I had signed this, it would be utterly worthless. As I explained 5 minutes ago, this property is owned by an irrevocable trust. According to the foundational bylaws of the trust, the primary beneficiary cannot execute any lease agreement exceeding 30 days without the countersignature of the co-trustee." I pointed to the bottom of the forged page. "Do you see a signature from Walter Higgins on that paper?" Sheriff Miller looked at the document, then back at my passport, and finally at Sandra. The heavy, imposing weight of the law settled firmly back onto his shoulders. "No, ma'am, I do not." "Then this is not a lease," I concluded with absolute surgical precision. "This is a fraudulent document fabricated to commit criminal trespass and property theft. It is not a civil dispute. It is a felony in progress. The silence on the lawn was absolute. The autumn wind seemed to stop completely. Sandra was staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The intricate, desperate web of lies she had woven to save herself from bankruptcy had just been shredded by a passport stamp and a corporate bylaw. The false counterattack was entirely broken. Before Sandra could attempt to invent another lie, I decided to dismantle the last remaining pillar of their alliance. There is one more interesting detail on this forgery, I said, pointing to the bottom left corner of the paper. There is a witness signature. It belongs to my father. I pulled my phone out again, navigated to my contacts, and pressed the dial button. I switched the audio to speakerphone and held the device up so everyone could hear. My father answered on the second ring, his voice still trembling with the same anxiety I had heard in his earlier voicemail. Maddie, did they arrive? Did you let them in? He asked frantically. Dad, you're on speakerphone with Sheriff Miller standing right next to me, I said, my voice perfectly neutral. Sandra just presented the police with a lease agreement for the farmhouse, dated October 14th. Your signature is on the bottom line as the verifying witness. The sheriff needs to know if you can confirm under oath that you watched me sign this document. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear the gears turning in my father's head as he realised the sheer magnitude of the legal disaster Sandra had dragged him into. He was a weak man, a man who preferred to let others handle the dirty work while he kept his hands clean. Faced with the immediate threat of criminal charges, his loyalty vanished instantly. No, my father blurted out, his voice cracking. No, I never signed that. I told her not to use that paper, Sandra. I told you this was a terrible idea. I am not going to jail for your mess. You coward, Sandra shrieked at the phone, completely losing her mind. She lunged forward, trying to grab the device, but Sheriff Miller swiftly stepped between us, holding his hand up in a firm, undeniable gesture of authority. That is enough, the sheriff barked. He looked at Sandra and Jessica, his patience entirely exhausted. You have presented a forged legal document to a law enforcement officer in an attempt to unlawfully occupy private property. The only reason you are not leaving this driveway in handcuffs right now is because Ms. Madeline has not formally requested to press fraud charges, yet he pointed a stern finger at the U-Haul. You have exactly 2 minutes to get into your vehicles and leave this county. If I ever receive another call to this address regarding you, you will be arrested on sight. Do you understand me? The alliance was completely dead. Jessica burst into genuine, hysterical tears, practically running toward her SUV without looking back at her mother. Sandra stood frozen for a moment, her chest heaving, staring at the farmhouse she had so desperately tried to steal. She looked at me one last time, expecting to see anger or gloating. She saw nothing. The doors slammed. The engines started. They drove away in disgrace. 3 days later, the digital fallout began. Jessica, sitting in the cramped living room of Sandra's soon-to-be foreclosed suburban house, decided to play her final desperate hand. She edited the chaotic footage she had taken in my driveway and posted it to her massive social media following. The video was a masterclass in manipulation. She cut out the sheriff's explanation, the forged document, and my calm responses. It was just a montage of her crying in a maternity dress, claiming her wealthy, heartless sister had thrown her out onto the street. For about 4 hours, the internet was furious. My professional inbox was flooded with angry emails, and a few minor clients called to express their concern over the family drama. But the truth, much like a well-structured trust, always holds its ground. Walter stepped in, acting as my professional shield. He didn't engage in internet shouting matches. Instead, he drafted a highly formalised cease and desist order, attaching the official police report, the evidence of the forged signature, and a clear warning of a defamation lawsuit. He sent it directly to Jessica's talent management agency and her primary corporate sponsors. The corporate world does not tolerate liability. Within 24 hours, the organic maternity brand that had advanced her $85,000 quietly terminated her contract, demanding a full refund for breach of terms. But the fatal blow didn't even come from Walter. It came from the internet itself. Social media sleuths are relentlessly observant. Several users dug up Jessica's old post videos where she bragged about buying a historic farmhouse. Alongside clips where she mocked my renovation efforts years earlier, they noticed the inconsistencies. They realised the timeline made no sense. The narrative flipped with brutal efficiency. The comments section of her victim video turned into an avalanche of criticism, calling out her lies and demanding accountability. Jessica tried to delete the negative comments, but the wave was too massive. She was forced to take down the video, post a heavily restricted apology text, and eventually deactivate her public profiles to hide from the backlash. She had built her entire identity on a carefully curated aesthetic, ignoring the fundamental reality that an illusion requires constant, expensive maintenance. When the funding dried up and the truth was exposed, the illusion shattered completely. I watched the digital collapse from the quiet comfort of my home office. I didn't celebrate her downfall. There was no joy in watching my sister's life unravel. It was simply the inevitable, mathematical conclusion of a poorly managed portfolio of lies. She had borrowed heavily against reality, and reality had finally collected its debt. I closed the laptop screen. The final phone call came a week before Thanksgiving. I was standing in the greenhouse, carefully pruning a row of winter jasmine, when my phone vibrated on the wooden workbench. The caller ID displayed Sandra's number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but the trustee in me needed to officially close the account. I wiped the soil from my hands and answered. "The bank took the house today." Sandra said. There was no greeting. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by the crushing reality of her financial ruin. "We have to be out by the end of the month. Your father and I are moving into a small rental apartment across town. Jessica is staying on a friend's couch." I listened to the sound of her breathing through the speaker. I didn't offer apologies. "I see," I replied calmly. Suddenly, the hollowness in her voice vanished, replaced by a sharp, bitter resentment. "Are you happy now, Madeline? You have a $1.4 million estate. You have all that space, all that money. How can you sleep at night knowing your own parents are being thrown out of their home over a measly $180,000 in debt? You could have saved us. You chose your paperwork over your family." It was the ultimate guilt trip, the final attempt to shift the blame for her decades of reckless choices onto my shoulders. She wanted me to believe that my financial discipline was a weapon that had destroyed her. Saving you would have required me to destroy myself. "Sandra," I said, my voice steady and completely free of anger. "You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a contingency plan. You spent my college fund. You drained your own equity to finance Jessica's illusions. You even stole the tuition money I sent for Mia. Kumot kai hojen kong jai kong, fai la bao hu, jo la tu sat. To save a bottomless black hole is not filial piety. It is suicide." "We are your family," she cried out, the desperation cracking her voice. "Blood makes us relatives. Respect makes us family." I corrected her gently. "You crossed a line when you tried to forge your way into my life. I will not pay for the consequences of your actions." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't want to hear another excuse, another lie, or another manipulation. The ledger was balanced. The debt was zero. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red icon, and permanently blocked the number. I set the phone back on the workbench and picked up my pruning shears. The greenhouse was perfectly warm, filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The silence was beautiful. 6 months passed. The Hudson Valley transitioned from a bitter, frozen winter into a vibrant, blooming spring. The farmhouse, free from the shadow of my family's entitlement, thrived. I expanded my professional network, turning the estate into an exclusive, high-end retreat for corporate strategy meetings. The property wasn't just a home anymore, it was a testament to independence. But my most important investment had nothing to do with real estate. On a bright Tuesday morning, I sat in Walter's office overlooking the city. We were finalising the paperwork for a new, highly specific financial structure. It was an independent education trust, established solely for the benefit of Mia. The rules were absolute. The trust would pay her tuition, medical bills, and extracurricular fees directly to the vendors. Jessica could not access a single penny of the principal or the interest. Furthermore, Walter served as the sole administrator, ensuring the funds were shielded from any future bankruptcies or bad decisions my sister might make. I didn't try to take Mia away from her mother. A dramatic custody battle would have only inflicted more trauma on a little girl who had already been used as a pawn. Instead, I secured her future from a distance, guaranteeing that no matter how chaotic Jessica's life became, Mia's education and stability were locked in a vault. That Thanksgiving, I hosted dinner at the farmhouse. The long, reclaimed wood table in the dining room was not surrounded by people who demanded my resources. It was surrounded by the family I had chosen. Walter was there, pouring wine and telling dry legal jokes that only half the table understood. My closest colleagues were there, sharing stories of hard-won victories, and sitting quietly near the end of the table, drawing a vibrant watercolour picture on a thick piece of paper, was Mia. Jessica had allowed her to visit for the weekend, perhaps finally understanding that my boundaries were immovable. Mia looked healthier. The anxious tension that used to grip her small shoulders had softened. She held up her painting for me to see a bright green greenhouse under a blue sky. "It's beautiful." "Mia?" I smiled, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. I looked around the room, listening to the genuine laughter and the clinking of glasses. There was no manipulation here. There were no hidden motives, no forged documents, and no invisible expectations. Everyone sitting at this table respected the space they occupied. They understood the value of the home we were sharing. I finally belonged. I stepped out onto the front porch, leaving the warmth of the Thanksgiving dinner behind for a brief moment. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing, looking out over the sprawling lawn where the U-Haul had parked all those months ago. The driveway was empty now, save for the cars of people who actually cared about me. Society tells us a dangerous lie about family. We are conditioned to believe that shared DNA is a sacred contract, demanding infinite forgiveness and boundless sacrifice. We are told to keep the peace, to absorb the damage, and to set ourselves on fire, to keep our relatives warm. But standing here, on the solid foundation of a life I built with my own bleeding hands, I know the truth. A toxic family will label your boundaries as selfishness. They will call your self-respect a betrayal. They will try to convince you that your success belongs to them simply because they were in the room when you started. But a true legacy isn't inherited. It isn't handed down in a forged document or demanded through emotional blackmail. A true legacy is what you build in the quiet moments. It is the peace you secure when you finally stop trying to earn the love of people who only see you as a resource. It is the future you protect for a little girl who deserves better than the chaos she was born into. My legacy is this farmhouse. It is the ironclad trust that guards it. It is the unbreakable boundary I drew in the dirt when I decided that my life belonged entirely to me. I took one last look at the stars beginning to pierce through the twilight sky. I felt no guilt. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the deep, unshakable satisfaction of a ledger perfectly balanced. I turned around, my hand resting on the brass handle of the front door. The warmth of my chosen family spilled out into the cold night. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that boundaries are better than bad blood, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, strength, and quiet victories. The door clicks shut.